Good evening, Western Civ 1. We're going to be continuing the lecture on art and architecture in late antique Roman Empire. Now, what you're seeing here is a reconstruction of what Constantinople must have looked like around the year 350, around the year 350. So this is basically the city Constantine left behind. Now, one thing you always find in a city in the Eastern Roman Empire is this, and in almost all big Roman cities, but especially in the Eastern Empire, that's the Hippodrome. Hippos is Greek for horse. You know, a hippopotamus is a river horse in Greek. Well, this was a horse race track. They were always long ovals like that. Hippodrome. In Latin, it would be called a circus, a circle, but it's not really a circle. They're very long. The Romans were crazy about horse racing, and in the Eastern Roman Empire especially, but it was chariot racing. I showed, I believe, to your class Ben-Hur, so you know what a hippodrome would have looked like in action. But these things are always right at the center of a late antique city in the East. See all that seating there? The crowds, this was the biggest place a crowd could gather. And each of the teams, and they were named after colors, blues, greens, reds, yellows. The horse race teams, the chariot teams, each had fan clubs. They were called Nika clubs, victory clubs. Nike, or Nike, you know, like the shoes. Nike is Greek for victory. Nike, victory clubs. They would be seated in different parts of the stadium, wearing their distinctive colors for their team, and they would put up chants in the Hippodrome, and the emperor was always there. This is the imperial palace, right next door to the Hippodrome. He could walk comfortably from his palace into the Hippodrome to the imperial box. That, incidentally, was the Cathedral of Constantinople, which also connected by a hall to the imperial palace. But the emperor was always at these horse races, and he would hear chants from the Nika clubs. That was the closest thing they had to public polling for an emperor to know what the people thought. And so the Nika clubs were very important for that reason. Here I said is the cathedral. We'll see the cathedral that Justinian built in just a minute. But that was the original Hagia Sophia. Hagia Sophia is Greek for holy wisdom. Sometimes you'll see it Saint Sophia, but it really is holy wisdom, another name for the Holy Spirit in Scripture. So that's the Cathedral of Holy Wisdom. There's also this big plaza with a giant column in it. See it there? That was a giant column that Constantine had put up. Inside that column were relics of great events in Christianity. There was said to be a thorn from the crown of thorns Jesus wore at his death there. There was said to be a piece of manna there from the Israelite time in the wilderness that I'm rather dubious about. But anyway, meanwhile, these buildings down here, these were like the law courts and the like, right down here on the water. This right here is the Golden Horn. That's the commercial harbor of Constantinople. So this was a city of maybe 300,000 people at its height around the end of the 300s, the beginning of the 400s. But Justinian, I talked about in the last lecture, had a brand new cathedral built. Now, ignore these minarets. The Turks put those up 1,000 years later. The Turks would conquer Constantinople in 1453, and they would turn Constantinople into a Muslim city, and this great Christian cathedral into a Muslim mosque, and that's what those are there for. But the church itself was built by Justinian in the 350s AD, and then rebuilt after a big earthquake in the 530s and the 540s, 530, 540 AD. Pardon me. You can see this great dome. That doesn't look so great from the inside, from the outside, but it is the second biggest dome in the world until 1967, when the Astrodome opened in Houston. This was the second biggest dome space in the world this was the biggest dome space in the world until St. Paul's Basilica in Rome opened in the 1540s. So for 1,000 years, this was the biggest domed area on earth, the great Cathedral of Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom in Constantinople. This is some of the detail. Again, ignore these things. These are quotes from the Quran that were put up there by Muslims after it was captured in 1453, and they turned it into a mosque. They painted all of this beautiful stuff white, but in the 20th century, the white paint was stripped off. And you can see the magnificent mosaics that decorated every surface of this beautiful church. And this gives you an idea of that gigantic dome. The scale of this is a couple of 100 feet high. Enormous dome. Enormous dome. Maybe a little better picture here to give you a whole scope. You could put much of the population of Constantinople inside this church. This is the great church of Holy Wisdom built by Justinian in the 530s and 540s in Constantinople. That's the giant central dome. Look at that clear story, the windows there letting the sunlight in. It's said, I have not got to visit it in person yet. It's said that that dome looks like it's floating on a crown of light. But even these windows, which are gigantic, they're like 25 feet high each anyway, letting in a lot of light into this space, natural light into this space. Just a giant. Those are individual adult humans walking around down there. That's what you see down there. So that just gives you an idea of how huge this space was. Okay. Now, I started my last lecture by reminding you of this guy. This man is Constantine the Great. That is a gigantic statue of him. I wish they had a picture of a human standing next to it. It's outside at the City Museum of Rome today. And if you had a person standing there, a grown man would come up to right about there on this thing. So that is probably, I'd say, 15 feet from the bottom of his neck to the top of his head. This was a gigantic statue found for centuries inside the main basilica in Rome itself. That's Constantine the Great. That's what the first Christian Roman emperor looked like. But looking at the art of the late antique period, one thing we see is this is still fairly naturalistic. It still looks like a normal human being, except look at the size of his eyes. Late antique portraits almost always have bizarrely big eyes. The reason for that was twofold. If you're an emperor, this says, I'm watching everything. I'm keeping an eye on our enemies so they won't hurt you, but I'm also keeping an eye on you. So this is a subtle way of sending a message that the emperor is always on the lookout. Now, another example of portraiture, there's a great example of it. This is the Philosopher Plotinus, a statue of the Philosopher Plotinus. Art in this period often sent signals. Now, by wearing this old-fashioned toga, that was not the kind of thing most Roman men wore by the 400s and 500s AD. That would be a very old-fashioned thing to wear, almost like dressing up like George Washington or something would be for us. But the people who still did dress that way in public were philosophers and senators as a class. Senators as a class would still wear this very old-fashioned clothing, but so would philosophers. This man is a philosopher. I can tell because of the beard. See that beard on him? Most men in this period were clean-shaven. You saw the statue of Constantine. He was clean-shaven. If you were wearing a beard in this period, you're probably intentionally wanting to show the world you're a philosopher. Another example, this is from Egypt, Coptic Egypt, in the 300s AD. Again, notice that they don't care so much about proportion on these figures. This is not a dwarf or something. This is supposed to be a normal man, but his head and his face are too big. He looks kind of stubby, and most of the full-body portraits from the late antique period look a little stubby and chunky. But look at the size of his eyes again. Now, this is something from the very period right before late antiquity. So this is, well, this is around 300. This is very early in the period of late antiquity. Now, that's a highly naturalistic portrait, isn't it? That is a portrait of Eastern Roman people. Looks like probably, I'm betting that's probably the three children of a family would be my guess. The adult daughter, the teenage daughter, and a son, I suspect. But you can see there that they are wealthy people, or they would not have been able to have this portrait painted. But also notice the women are wearing silk that's very beautifully decorated. That would have had to have come from China. And yes, they had trade with China, but this was incredibly expensive stuff, not to mention the magnificent pearl earrings that the adult woman is wearing and pearl necklace she's wearing. So that is a great example of stuff at the very beginning, art at the very beginning. This is a bit later. This is a mosaic from probably the early 500s of a government official. Again, notice those big staring eyes. But this is a government official, probably a tax collector, but notice he's wearing a military uniform. As late antiquity went on, essentially the entire government apparatus was turned into the army. Remember my saying, if you have to give an answer about the Roman Empire, always try the army first. All right, so I'm going to find you a few more images to give you a better feel for late antique art. Okay, let me hold on just a second. I think there's some good ones at the back of this book. All right. Great. So this is a mosaic from a church. Let me see if I can get the page so it won't gloss so badly. There we go. That's mosaic. It is made of tiny little colored tiles of stone. Thousands of tiny tiles of stone. But notice again, this is giving you an image of power, not of natural appearance. Look at how they're standing, stiff and straight and tall. So you can tell those are men, but they're really almost like icons or something. They're symbols of the power of the church and of the state. In fact, that is the bishop and the governor of Thessalonica on each side of Saint Demetrius, the patron saint of Thessalonica in Greece. So this is from the Cathedral. I saw this back in the year 2001. And it's a great example of mosaic work from late antiquity. The church benefited immensely from the largesse of the emperors. This is a reliquary. This was a box for containing like body parts of a saint, gold and jewels. But look at the crucifix. Again, you can see the style of art in late antiquity wasn't worried about naturalistic look. It was worried about conveying the imagery, the meaning behind the imagery. Here's a late antique Bible from after the Germanic invasions. Nope, sorry. That's just before the Germanic invasions. My apologies. That is a Bible. That is Codex Sinaiticus, an illustration from the Bible, produced about in the year 340. And this is the cover of a gospel book. In church, the Gospels would be read from books that were covered in these magnificent covers of gold and jewels. So that's just a little taste of art in late antiquity. There you can see a mosaic of the zodiac. See those symbols of the zodiac around Apollo in his chariot. It was a Christian empire, but they still use the imagery of classical mythology. Okay, that will wrap up our quick tour of late antique art and architecture. God bless.